In the class struggle in France, Marx clearly states that the Blanquists had already claimed the dictatorship of the proletariat and the abolition of classes. What characterizes Marx's conception, therefore, is that he determines the conditions of both the one and the other, that is, what constitutes scientific communism. Blanqui's communism is a revolutionary communism, but not a scientific one. The problem of choosing the times and means for the realization of communism is not subjective, but is inscribed in the tradition of the struggle that the party embodies in its long history, not simply littered with defeats or victories, but with lessons. We are accused of being insensitive to changing conditions, of remaining entrenched in a kind of paleo-Marxism valid for a certain historical period now buried and dead. All this because we do not indulge in the flat sociologism in fashion, but the historical method is one thing, the sociological metaphysical method is quite another. Capital, says Lenin ironically against the sociologist Mikhailovsky, is not a work corresponding to the purpose for the metaphysical sociologist who has not realized the sterility of a priori reasoning about the nature of society and does not realize that, instead of studying and explaining, such methods merely insinuate, as a conception of society, the bourgeois ideas of an English merchant, or the ideas of petty bourgeois socialism of a Russian democrat, and nothing more. At best, they were merely a symptom of the ideas and social relations of their time, but they did not advance by one jot mankind's understanding of social revelations, even individual ones, but real ones, and not those corresponding to human nature. And again, the gigantic step forward taken by Marx in this respect consisted precisely in that he discarded all these arguments about society and progress in general and produced a scientific analysis of one society and one of progress, capitalist. Here was the problem. A given society and a given progress are analyzed in their internal dynamics, in their characteristic forms, which are valid for the entire epoch of their existence and do not change because the consciousness wills it or because of the convenience of shortcut. We wrote about the historical invariance of Marxism, the materialist rejection of the idea that a theoretical system, which arose at such and such a moment, or worse still, arose in the mind and was systematized within the work of a given man, thinker, or historical leader, or any other of those things combined, can encompass the entire course of future history, its laws and principles, is an irrevocable way. Shouldn't be understood as a rejection of the notion that system of principles can be stable over extremely long periods of time. In fact, their stability and resistance to attack and to being improved as well means they constitute a major weapon in the armory of the social class to which they belong and whose historical task and interest they reflect. The succession of such systems and bodies of doctrine and praxis is tied not to the advent of outstanding man, but rather to the succession of modes of production, that is, to the type of material organization of the living human collectively. And again, according to Marxism, historical progress in the realm, above all, of organization and productive resources is not continuous and gradual, but is rather a series of consecutive, widely spaced leaps forward which cause profound disruption in the entire socio-economic apparatus, shaking it to its very foundation. These are genuine cataclysms, disasters, rapid crises, in which everything changes very quickly after having stayed the same for a very long period of time, as with the physical world, with the stars in the cosmos, with geology, and with the phylogenesis of living organisms themselves. For Marxism, contradictory reality is not resolved once and for all in the unity of conceptions in its duration, so that on every occasion it becomes easy to go fishing in the illusory top hat for the answer, and any answer at all, to the problems that historically arise. We said that for Marxism, there is no continuous and gradual progress in history, but a series of distant, successive leaps forward that upset the whole socio-economic apparatus deeply and from the bottom up. The political struggles, the great battles, and the long war that is the class struggle are the living concentrate of these abrupt upheavals, and their clear sanction almost consecrate or curse forever the instruments and weapons for the conquest of victory. There is no turning back. Since class ideology is a superstructure of the modes of production, it is not shaped by the daily flow of particles of knowledge either, but appears within the chasm produced by a violent clash. and it guides the class whose expression it is, in a substantially monolithic and stable form, through a long series of struggles and convulsions until the next critical phase is reached, until the next historical revolution. Marxism itself isn't a doctrine which can be molded and remolded each day by adding and changing bits of it, patching it up more like, because it is still counted amongst those doctrines, even to the final one, which functions as a weapon of a dominant and exploited class, which needs to overturn social relations, and the process of which it is subjected, in 1,001 ways, to the conservative influence of the traditional forms and ideology of the enemy classes. That's an important paragraph. For Marxism, dialectics is not movement in general, or that which conscience commands. Otherwise, we would assume what is in question or what we doubt as simplicio does in the dialogue of the chief systems. Against the appearance of movement, which not only does not keep the program fixed, but compromises it definitively, we respond, even if we can now, or rather since the proletariat appeared on the great historical sense, glimpse the history of the future society without classes, and therefore without revolutions, it must be affirmed that, for the very long period that will lead to this, the revolutionary class will be in the meantime fulfill its task insofar as it will move using a doctrine in a method that remains stable and is stabilized in a monolithic program throughout the tremendous struggle, the number of followers remaining variable, the success of the phases and social clashes. All this because real and objective power relations are determined in the movement, not removable by stroke of will. With appeals to the need to transform the world independently of the transformations determined by the clashes of collective forces. This too has earned our position the accusation of dogmatism, a term that, in the classical German philosophical tradition, is equivalent to materialism, an accusation that we have never been ashamed, if anything, we have been justifiably proud of. That's hard. The clash of collective forces in the modern class struggle rests on the terrain of opposing interest, discernibly with the precision of the natural sciences. As Marx reminds us in the introduction to his critique of political economy, capital is a monument erected, as vivid proof of these possibilities of analysis and synthesis, and thus of prediction. History itself, writes Marx, in the sense in the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts 3:2, is a real part of natural history, of natural development into man. Natural sciences will in time incorporate into itself the science of man, just as the science of man will incorporate into itself natural science, in the sense that it will adopt its experimental methods, and in this historical dialectical sense, there will be one science. Let the opponents see in such a statement a pure utopia or crude materialism. Reminds me of the book We by Yevgeny. The experience of the class struggle, especially in the current inauspicious years of counter-revolution, serves to demonstrate that he who has deluded himself into updating in the name of the creativity of consciousness, or worse, of the so-called masses, finds themselves grazing in the same meadow, now no longer so green as the hated bourgeoisie. Although, therefore, the ideological endowment of the revolutionary working class is no longer revelation, myth, and idealism, as it was for previous classes, but positive science instead, it nevertheless still needs a stable formulation of its principles and rules of action, which fulfill the purpose of having the same decisive efficacy as the dogmas, catechisms, tables, constitutions, and the books of guidance, such as Vedas, the Talmud, the Bible, the Quran, and the Bill of Rights had in the past. The profound error of forms and substance contained in those books did not detract from, indeed in many cases they contributed to, the enormous organizational and social force which was first revolutionary, then counter-revolutionary, in dialectical succession. This is why, just as we've always rejected the gradualist and Menshevik thesis of revolution by stages, so we reject the equally opportunist and counter-revolutionary conception of the party and its formation by stages. Only in appearance can the stages give the illusion of a correct and concrete conception of revolutionary space-time. In reality, they are the idealist pretense of dividing the time unit into arbitrary parts, and the phases dominated by consciousness. They are once again a mystified movement that has not coincidentally rediscovered the eternal values above history and class struggle. We know that what names these eternal values have assumed. They are democracy, liberty, justice, law, a whole paraphernalia which we have long ago and once and for all come to terms. The party itself cannot pretend to adjust the stages as it sees fit, another being its task, namely to foresee and advance the unfolding of events and the unleashing of forces in order to direct them towards revolutionary ends. A new doctrine cannot appear at just any historical moment. There are given very characteristic and also very rare periods in history, like a dazzling beam of light one can appear, and if the crucial moment is not recognized and the terrible light not faced, it is no good resorting to the little candles instead, by which the way is lit for academic pedants and fighters of little faith. Just as in these rare epochs, the clash of forces in the field determine adjustments or upheavals equal to true natural catastrophes, so they mark for both camps a series of lessons not to be forgotten, in victory and defeat. This was the case for the bourgeoisie in its revolutionary ascent. This has been imposed on the rising proletariat, those who have claimed to dictate law to the forces of history, and with academic pedantry or a feeble defeatist intellectualism, have contributed to clipping the wings of the revolutionary movement when it was being driven to the trenches by the forces of social determinations, or have horrendously sent it to the slaughter when it was necessary to execute an orderly retreat in defense in anticipation of new favorable conditions. History cannot be sliced into pieces. It cannot be measured in stages. The clock, even the atomic one, is after all still a rudimentary instrument incapable of imposing its prefabricated rhythms on the social entrails stirred by an infinite series of material determinations. When it is then pointed out that times change and it is not permissible to transpose past situations with current conditions, it is necessary to forcefully reiterate that it is still true, but not in the sense that the situations of the moment are unpredictable realities before which it is futile to align text and theses. In this case, the true scientific dialectic precisely makes us the figure of the incorruptible motion of the heavens, which under the guise of unvaried circular motion hides the unity of the concept in its immutability. Marx summarizes in his well-known letter to Schweitzer in 24th January 1965 the lessons of the poverty of philosophy, which fits perfectly in for our discourse, saying that he had shown here how little Proudhon may have penetrated the mystery of the scientific dialectic, and how often, on the other hand, he may have shared the illusions of speculative philosophy that, instead of regarding economic categories as the theoretical expression of historical relations of production, corresponding to a particular stage of development in material production, he garbles them into pre-existing eternal ideas, and how in this roundabout way he arrives once more at the standpoint of bourgeois economy. We underline that particular stage of development in material production in order to highlight how ideas and thus conscious positions, decisions, orders, and new theses cannot be justified except by objective determinations, which must be detected, justified, and proposed in line. Thus, as we say, aligns in the thread of time before claiming to decide. Therefore, it is necessary to first lay out the alleged new facts on the anatomical table and draw practical conclusions, so to speak in our case, organizational conclusions, as a necessary result of the preventative operation. Organizational rules would have changed if the ends, the revolutionary tasks, had changed. The principle of the historical invariance of doctrines, which reflects the task of the protagonist classes, and also all the potent referring back to the founding principles, stands opposed to the gossipy assumption that every generation and every season of intellectual fashion is more powerful than the previous one. It rejects the whole silly film show, which portrays the relentless advance of civil progress and other such bourgeois prejudices from which very few of those who lay claim to the adjective Marxist are really free. It is a principle which applies to every great historical period, but the misunderstanding for the sophisticated bourgeoisie and the opportunist ideology of our day lies precisely in the exchange, inadmissible for Marxism, between the discovery that there are no absolute truths, and the worship of the fact, a typical distortion of shitty positivism. All the greater, then, the confusion becomes when one claims to be faced with the alleged new facts, that would justify adjustments or adaptations of the entire doctrine, or which, and this is a variant of the same attitude, would recommend the reaffirmation in words of the doctrine, but its correction in practice, action, tactics, organization. Yet already, the new science of Galileo, according to a critic of our times, Bonfim, has established that science is a continuous interfering of experience and reason, and that all scientific knowledge is a resolution of an empirical discontinuity, the datum, the fact, and irrational continuum of relations that are not concretely thinkable except on the basis of discontinuity. For us, rational continuum of relations can only be historical and resulting from the dialectical alignment along the thread of time of the class struggle, with its repercussion on all fields, not only on that of the pure economic forces, which cannot exist separately, but also on the fact of the superstructures, which include the much adored science or ideology or laws or politics. Today, we must bitterly note that even those whom we would have least suspected discover the shortcut of politics, that is, of being in some way present according to the moralist maxim, and it can't be said that I wasn't there, the quintessence of anarchic, petty bourgeois individualism. So too C. Bernard, an unconscious Marxist, as Lenin would say, on the subject of the much-trumpeted functionality of fact, after having rightly pointed out that experience is the privilege of reason, see his introduction to the study of experimental medicine, observes, yes, the experiment undoubtedly forces nature to explain itself by attacking it, and ask it questions in all directions, but he must never answer for it, nor listen incompletely to its answers, taking from the experience the part of the results that favor or confirm the hypotheses. Our ideas are but intellectual instruments that serve us to penetrate into phenomena, and it is necessary to change them when they have fulfilled their role. In other words, the abandonment of instruments is necessary when they fulfilled their role, in our language, in the same way that Marxism excludes any kind of search for absolute truth, by seeing doctrine not as evidence of a timeless spirit or abstract reason, but as an instrument of work, as a weapon of combat. It postulates that when exerting yourself to the utmost in a pitched battle, you don't send your tools or weapons off for repair, but rather, in order to win in both peace and war, you need from the beginning the right equipment and weapons to brandish at the enemy. Much less, however, in our case, can the experimenter arrogate to himself the power to adapt the means of independently of the rational continuum of relations that are the never refuted lessons of more than a century and a half of class struggle, whereby either this position remains valid, or the doctrine will have shown itself to be false, and the announced appearance of a new class with its own character, program, and revolutionary function in history will have all been in vain. Whoever therefore sets out to change parts of the Marxist corpus, its theses and essential articles, which have been in our possession for around a century now, saps its strength far more than he who renounces it in full and declares it aborted. Since the doctrine is a corpus, i.e. an organic unity, it cannot be recognized as valid with regards to the ends and to be readjusted with regards to the means. Since the means have been codified in relation to the ends and have imposed themselves into the fire of the struggle, not in the mind of the ideologue, even if he is Karl Marx, Lenin says in his talk with the defenders of economism. They are muddled over the question of the relations between the material, spontaneous elements of the movement and the ideological, conscious, operating according to plan. They fail to understand that the ideologist is worthy of the name only when he precedes the spontaneous movement, points out that the road is able ahead of all the others to solve all the theoretical, political, tactical, and organizational questions which the material elements of the movement spontaneously encounter. In order truly to give consideration of the material elements of the movement, one must view them critically. One must be able to point out the dangers and the defects of spontaneity and elevate it to a level of consciousness. To say, however, that ideologists, politically conscious leaders, cannot divert the movement from the path determined by those interactions of the environment and the elements is to ignore the simple truth that the conscious element participates in this interaction and in the determination of the path. Catholic and monarchist labor unions in Europe are also an inevitable result of the interaction of environments and elements, but it was the consciousness of Priest and Zubatov's founder in the 1901 to 1903 of the workers' unions under the auspices of the police, and not that of the socialists that participate in this interaction. And so, in what sense does it make to claim that the program remaining fixed, proletarians should go and defend the crumb of the right that the bourgeoisie grants, fallen from its lavish banquet? Faced with the increasingly clear confirmation of Marxist predictions, bourgeois ideological reaction infiltrates into the workers' movement and among its leaders. Instead of contesting it in bloc, it mutilates it, either in its revolutionary conclusion or in its strategic, tactical, organizational consequences. In other words, it seeks precisely to make Marxism a mere ideology, or to reduce to it more or less amorphous compilation of facts. Lenin continues in Marxism and Revisionism, but after Marxism had ousted all the more or less integral doctrines hostile to it, the tendency expressed in those doctrines began to seek other channels. The form and cause of these struggles changed, but the struggle continued. Pre-Marxist socialism has been defeated. It is continuing the struggle, not longer on its own inadequate grounds, but on the general ground of Marxism as revisionism, and it patently follows from the very nature of this revisionist policy that it may assume an infinite variety of forms, and that every more or less new question, every more or less unexpected and unforeseen turn of events, even though it changed the basic line of development only to an insignificant degree, and only for the briefest period, will always inevitably give rise to one variety of revisionism or another. The inevitability of revisionism is determined by its class roots in modern society. Revisionism is an international phenomena. So is revisionism from the left. Faced with certain phenomena, it has always been necessary for us to hammer the nails back again, to restore. On the other hand, this is not simply a modern problem. There is no lack of example of restorers in the face of revisionist degeneration, as Francis was with the respect to Christ, when Christianity arisen to redeem the meek, made itself comfortable in the courts of the medieval signori. So were the Gracchi, with respect to Lucius Junius Brutus, and so many times the standard-bearer of an up-and-coming class had to be with respect to the revolutionary renegade from the heroic phase of previous classes. Struggle in France, 1831, 1848, 1849, and innumerable other phases throughout Europe. Our task, therefore, is not to continue the work of restoration. Organizational readjustment are not justified in light of the corpus of doctrine, principles, tactical strategy, in their organic nexus, and moreover, not even today in the name of some new fact. Will the resumption of the great struggles perhaps be the new fact? It has not been said on the contrary. We have always maintained that the resumption of the revolutionary movement does not mechanically arise from the worsening of the crises of capitalist mode of production, even though it may contribute to the awakening of the class struggle. Other conditions must occur, which are also objective names of the resumption of the political struggle. The refutation of opportunist lies regarding socialist camps to defend or extend, etc. All these conditions do not arise because it will be pleasant. Therefore, if Marxist communism is scientific, as we have said at the outset, in that it identifies the conditions of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the abolition of classes against any other form of revolutionary communism, we wrote, "At present, we are at the lowest point in the curve of the revolutionary potential, and therefore centuries away from the next of those moments which will be conducive to the appearance of a new historical theory. In the present situation, with no imminent prospects of a great social upheaval, it is not just the political disintegration of the global proletariat class which is no longer the result. Just as logical is the example of a small group which knows how to maintain the guiding historical threads of the great revolutionary course, stretched like a great arc between two social revolutions, on condition that these groups show no desire to spread an original idea, but remain strictly attached to the traditional formulations of Marxism. This certainly does not mean, as was once said to us by our opponents, to sit back on the class struggle, and as is now reproduced to us, to contemplate the monolithic and homogeneous program, since the transformation of the world is no matter of subjective initiatives, but a clash of collective forces. When in the famous theses on Feuerbach, Marx said that the philosophers had done enough interpreting of the world, and that the time had come to change it, he did not mean that the willing change conditions the change itself, but that change determined by the clash of collective forces comes first and only, then critical consciousness of it by individual subjects. Indeed, The latter don't act on the basis of the decisions with which each is developed separately, but on the basis of influences which precede science and precede consciousness. And again, in passing from the weapon of criticism to the criticism of weapon, one actually transfers everything from the thinking subject to the militant mass, in such a way that not only rows and cannons serve as weapons, but above all the real instruments which in the common uniform, monolithic and steadfast doctrine of the party, to which we are all subordinate and bound, bringing gossiping and know-it-all discussion to an end. This is what constitutes the sound determinist dialectical conception as it was perfectly set forth by Engels when in the Dialectic of Nature he dealt with the relationship between causality, necessity, and chance, and the dialectic and with absolute determinism past the metaphysical French materialism in science, i.e. from fatalism equivalent to the eternal divine counsel of St. Augustine and Calvin, to the kismet of the Turks, from those theological conception of nature. Let's look at Bernard's brilliant definition, always better the unconscious Marxist than the damned conscious Marxist. Fatalism supposes the necessary manifestation of a phenomena independently of its condition, whereas determinism is the necessary condition of a phenomena, the manifestation of which is not forced. And again, thanks to our experience, we can grasp relationships between phenomena that, although partial and relative, will allow us to extend our power over nature more and more. Experimental reasoning aims at the same end in all sciences. The experimenter wants to arrive at determinism. That is, he seeks to connect natural phenomena to their condition of existence, or otherwise of their approximate causes, by means of reasoning and experience. He arrives by this route at the law that enables him to make himself master of the phenomena. All natural science boils down to this, to know that the law of phenomena. Every experimental problem boils down to this, to predict and direct phenomena. In essence, we are faced, what Marx and Engels say, we cannot master phenomena except by submitting ourselves to the laws that govern them. Freedom is recognized necessity. The Marxist theory of the class struggle does not content itself with knowing of its existence, but recognizes its objective condition, its laws, on the basis of this knowledge, draws a plan of practical intervention, program, that is, of revolutionary activity. Far from the discovery of new facts at every step, here we speak of laws, and laws are norms, that is, observed and classified realities, therefore actual determinations, in our case social ones, hence not due to any subjective arbitrariness. In the false resource of activism, we consistently stated, the Marxist thesis states it is impossible, first of all, for the consciousness of the historical road to appear in advance within a single human brain. This is for two reasons. Firstly, consciousness follows rather than precedes being, that is, the material conditions which surround the subject of the consciousness itself. Secondly, all forms of social consciousness, with a given delay allowing them to get generally established, emerge out of the circumstances which are analogous and parallel to the economic relations in which masses of individuals find themselves, thereby forming a social class. Historically, the latter are then led to act together, long before they can think together. The theory of this relationship between class conditions and class actions in its future point of arrival isn't required of persons, in the sense it isn't required of a particular author or leader, nor is it asked of the class as a whole, in the sense of a fleeting lump sum of individuals in the existence of a certain time and place, and much less can it be deduced from an extremely bourgeois consultation of the class. All that remains is the party, and as the existing organ, which defines the class, struggles for the class, and when the time comes governs for the class and prepares for it when there will be no government and no classes. From these premises follows the organic relationship of the historical life of the party, whose physical presence in this organization only in the sense of being the consequently historical result of a series of conditions that neither depend nor can depend on the divine illumination of anyone, but which must precede the consciousness of both leaders and rank and file, united only by the common subordination to the program and all its articulations, known in advance and binding for all. Still, from these premises follows the sound and materialist way of understanding the political organization and class party, according to the ever-relevant words of Lenin, the attitude of workers' parties to religion. A political organization cannot put its members through an examination to see if there's no contradiction between their views and the party program. He means that in the Marxist Communist Party, All those stupid disciplinary measures of a Catholic, anarchist, rationalist, individualist, bourgeois flavor, which purport to govern the party through examinations of conscience, of wisdom, of ideological purity, with self-criticism and repentance, are banned as odious and counterproductive. The terrain on which the efficiency of the strength of the party is measured is in social warfare, and discipline in battle, and not in intentions. In a word, in executive discipline, under orders, voluntary and spontaneously, of a military type. Ideological terrorism, on the other hand, paralyzes revolutionary passion, hinders militia, frees insofar as it's recognized as necessary, not by compulsion of Tom or Dick, or worse, because of the particular charm of Tom or Dick, but insofar as powerful social determinations push the forces onto the terrain of class struggle, thus making them both instruments and actors at the same time, in a dialectical unity in which it becomes an empty exercise to cut with a knife at a desk what pertains to the free will of the subject, or the blind necessity of nature.